Okay, so the next thing for us to install is our AIO. Really what we have is a pump, some tubes and a radiator. The pump has a cold plate on it, and this is up against the CPU with some thermal paste between the two of them. So as the CPU makes heat, the water coming past it helps cool the CPU. The hot water then goes back to the radiator. We're going to have fans on the radiator blowing cool air through the radiator, hopefully cooling the water. And then we've got cooler water coming back to the CPU, and that cycle continues. So the first thing for us to do is to put our fans onto the radiator, and it's important we put the fans at the right orientation. So I've already had a look at the case, and I think the tubes over to the right hand side are going to look better than the tubes to the left hand side. We're going to want to put our radiator up at the top of the case and the fans on the inside. You can do it either way, but if we put the fans at the top, we're not going to see the RGB from the fans, and all we're going to see is the radiator. So it's going to look much better having some light coming into the case. So it's important we have radiator and then fans. It's also important we put the fans on the radiator the right way, and we've already talked about the orientation of the fans on the case fan installation section. So this is the front of the fans. It's going to bring air in from the front and out the back. And we want to set our radiator as an exhaust at the top. So we're going to install our fans in this orientation so that they are exhausting air through the radiator. I tend to have the radiators at the top as exhaust and the radiators at the front as intake, and that just fits with the natural process of air moving through the case. In general, an intake is going to give you better CPU temperatures. The reason I've stayed away from intake in this particular case is I think it's going to look slightly better at the top. The other important thing with the fans is we want the cables coming from them at the back of the case. So that's going to mean the cables are going to have to be here. So we'll go ahead and secure the fans to the radiator using the long screws that come with the AIO. Next, because our case has the detachable top bracket, we can go on ahead and fit the radiator to the bracket outside the case. So I'm just going to line it up with the middle of this bracket, and then we can secure it in place using the shorter screws that come with the AIO. Okay, so before I put the AIO on, I'm just going to feed the cables for each of the fans out the back, because obviously once it's on, it's going to be much more difficult to feed them. So the first thing to plug in is there's going to be a triple fan splitter cable, which each of the fans in the radiator at the back is going to plug into, and this is going to need to go into the CPU fan header. So the CPU fan header is the header at the top of the motherboard on the left hand side. The one to the right of it is for the pump header. So I'll go ahead and plug the fan header in. I'm going to bring it in from the back. Okay, so that's plugged into place. Okay, so coming from our pump, we've got two connectors. One is for RGB, the other is a 3-pin fan connector, and that's going to power our pump. So although the header on the motherboard has got 4 pins, we've already mentioned there's no problem plugging a 3-pin header into it and making sure we run it in DC mode. I'm just going to get that plugged in, and again it's only going to go on one way on the right 3 pins because of the little notches on the cable. And I'm just going to push this one for the RGB through the back. And start to pull the excess cable coming from the pump header out the back as well. Okay, so we can now go ahead and secure the top bracket back onto the case. So one thing I forgot to mention earlier, I have used this CPU cooler before. Whenever you first get it out of the box, instead of this AMD bracket that's on it, there's an Intel one already on it. It's easy enough to replace. All you do is apply a little bit of pressure here and the bracket will slide out. You can then take this one, which is the AMD one, slide it back into place, and you're ready then to go ahead and install the cooler. So we can go ahead and add a little bit of thermal paste to the CPU. Normally just about a pea-sized amount in the center of the CPU is my preferred method of doing this. That looks about right. And then we can go ahead and just put the little clips from the bracket over the little clips on the motherboard at the top and then at the bottom. Okay, so that's the little clips on each side. All we need to do is tighten the 2 screws to secure the cooler. And again, we want to make sure we don't over tighten it. So generally I tighten one side, then the other side a few turns, and just repeat that process. And that way you don't put too much pressure on one side at once. Okay, so now we come on to the tricky part, and that is connecting everything up. What's important to remember, each of the fans on the radiator has 2 wires coming from it. One is a 4-pin wire which needs power, and the other is an RGB connector. The pump header has already been powered. It's plugged into the pump header on the motherboard. So to get power to the fans, we've already plugged in a triple splitter cable to the CPU fan header. So all we need to do is plug each of the 4-pin connectors from the fans into that splitter cable. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, so that should be the power side of things taken care of. The fans are going to get their power via the CPU fan header, via that triple splitter, and the pump is going to get its power via the pump header. The alternative option, if your motherboard didn't have a pump header, there's a SATA connector which that can plug into and then go to your power supply. But because we have a pump header, it makes sense to plug into that. So now we come on to the RGB. So at the moment at the back of the case, we've got 4 RGB connectors, 1 coming from each of the fans and then 1 coming from the pump itself. So the first thing we need to do is connect a triple RGB connector up to each of the ones coming from the fans. So we'll go ahead and plug that in now. Okay, so that now leaves us 2 RGB connectors. There's a 3-pin connector coming from the pump and a 4-pin connector which is coming from that triple splitter cable from each of the fans. We've now got 2 options of how we can control the RGB in this case. We can use the controller that Lian supplies, or we can connect these into a cable and run it into the ARGB header on our motherboard. So because our motherboard doesn't actually have any RGB on it, I'm going to go ahead and use the controller. It's going to save us having to install the motherboard RGB software and make things a little bit simpler. Okay, so this is our controller. It has 2 connectors, one for a 3-pin, one for a 4-pin. So it makes sense that we go ahead and plug these into the corresponding pins. So the 3-pin one is going to go to the pump head. And then the 4-pin one is going to go to that triple RGB splitter cable. We're going to have buttons on this controller, which is going to let us adjust the RGB. So the only additional thing for us to do is to power this controller. And that's a SATA connector. So we're going to plug it into the SATA cable that we used earlier on. Just line up the L's. And there we go. That's our AIO installed.